Now that we understand who's being studied, we actually want to move into some of the results of the study. And so the actual data that's being collected from this group of 1,507 Americans, those are known as what we call the sample statistics. So these are the actual results of the study. So with this particular group of people, what were the results? The key is this data is specific to this group of 1,507 people. So, this is, results that apply only to the sample. And within a study like this, there is tons of sample statistics. So like here, if you look here on the article, we have this table here that talks about types of free speech and whether or not they support or oppose the right to engage in it. And you can get percentages, and they've broken it down by political party. All of these percentages here are their own form of sample statistics. For this one, we're going to just sort of focus, and we're going to look more at the sort of general conclusions of the study, which we're talking about people's feelings of, are they free to speak freely among different groups of people? And so when you're talking, or when you're asked about a sample statistic, I might be asked for what is the sample statistics for how people felt talking among acquaintances, what percentage felt completely free. And so my sample statistic, I would, say, it's types of interactions with acquaintances. And I have to be specific because all of these are different. So you want to pay attention to what piece of data they're looking for. And even within acquaintances, there are 3 different sample statistics. We have the completely free. And so I would say completely free. So these are the people who say they talk however they want among people they know. So they are completely free. And that was 31% of the people who did this survey. And then I could also say, the somewhat free group, that has a different sample statistic, because that one, 41% felt somewhat free. And then I could say not very at all was 26% of the people. Now, we want to be able to take these sample statistics, the things that are the conclusions about this particular small group of people, and we want to use them to make conclusions about the larger population. That's the purpose of a study. And so when we take our, small sample conclusions and then try and broaden their appeal, that's where we're sort of using what are known as population parameters. Now, we can't just go and say, well, since 31% of people in this survey felt that they were completely free to talk among acquaintances, therefore 31% of Americans feel the same way. It's not a direct relationship, because every study is going to have something that's known as a margin of error. And this is just sort of how much the researchers feel that the sample could be off. And it provides, when making conclusions about the larger population. Now, in good studies, you're going to be given that margin of error. They're going to tell you in the article or in their methodology what their margin of error is. And there is a very complicated formula for figuring it out. And if you go into statistics, you will have to learn it. But for the sake of this class, if you are ever asked to estimate the margin of error, you can do that by simply taking 1 divided by the square root of your sample size. And that would give you a rough estimate of what that margin of error is. Now, in this particular case, if we go back to that methodology paragraph, you will notice, so we have our 1,500 American residents, how they did it. So they called people. The data was weighted by age, race, ethnicity, who people voted for. And then it says with a margin of error of plus or minus 3.1 percentage points. And so the margin of error in this study, we write it this way. So we often say a plus and then a minus and 3.1%. And you want to be careful when reading it because you want to make sure that margin of error is for the entire group within the study, because sometimes within smaller subgroups, and when a study does look at different subgroups, they're going to give you margins of error for each of those small subgroups. For our sort of work this semester, we're going to be looking at the bigger margin of error, the margin of error for the entire study. Now, what do we do with this margin of error? Well, we're going to use the margin of error to create what is known as a confidence interval. And so that confidence interval is basically saying, in all likelihood, while we can't say for certain among the American population that 31% feels somewhat, comfortable speaking, feel completely comfortable using freedom of speech, we can create a range. And the actual, if I did a good job picking my sample, the true population probably would fall somewhere between that range if we were able to sample every single adult resident in America. And so to figure out that confidence interval, basically what you do is you take your sample statistic. So if we keep working with that acquaintances feeling completely free to speak freely, that sample statistic was 31%, if we remember. And so to figure out your confidence interval, you would subtract the margin of error, and that would get you your low value in your confidence interval. And then you're going to add the margin of error, and that's going to get you the high sort of part of your confidence interval. So here, if I subtract 3.1%, I would end up at 27.9%. And then if I added 3.1% to 31, I would get 34.1%. So in reality, I could make the conclusion that Americans, about 27.9%, somewhere between 27.9% and 34.1% of Americans feel completely free when talking amongst acquaintances. This would be just the confidence interval on its own. Now, often what we're going to be asked to do is sort of interpret its meaning. And when we do that, we sort of have a fixed sentence that we use. And this fixed sentence goes back to how confident the researchers are. Most studies are going to have what are known as a confidence level, and they're going to say usually it's 95%. Studies are 95% confident that their results are, valid and true. And if it's not specifically listed in the methodology, we assume that it's a 95% confidence. Because again, most valid studies, that's sort of the range that they're going to want to keep it within. So when we're interpreting the meaning of our confidence interval, we're going to actually sort of use a sentence, and it would start with a 95% confidence. So that's sort of giving our confidence level. We can say that between 27.9% and 34.1%. So notice I put in my confidence interval. And now I'm going to say the population. So between this percent and this percent of, and now we need our population. So our population was American residents ages 18 and older. So I went and I had, okay, my 95% confidence level, my confidence interval, my population, and then what are we saying? What is that sample statistic about? What conclusion are we making? So American residents ages 18 and older feel completely free from fear of retaliation, censorship, punishment when interacting with acquaintances. Make sure I get that. Acquaintances. Okay, so just so we can sort of go over the pieces of this sort of sentence again. So we start with our sort of confidence level. So this right here is our confidence level. We then have our confidence interval. And then we have that American residents ages 18 and older. That would be our population. And then last but not least down here was sort of the what is that percentage talking about. So the what are you asking about? And that's how we're able to take sort of our confidence interval and explain what it represents within a context. So when we're asked to interpret that meaning of a confidence interval, this sort of exercise of breaking down a study takes a lot of practice. So on the next slide, what you're going to see is you're going to see a link to a different study. And then you're basically going to go through and identify the exact same pieces of the study. We're going to do this a few times this week to get good at it. It just takes practice and sort of knowing where to look in an article. Feel free, especially at this sort of point, come back and refer to these vocab words. Go back and look at, what did I look for when I found the margin of error? What are other things that you're sort of doing? So again, this is sort of, what do we start with? We start with the goal, then we move on to the population, the sample statistics to use to find our sort of population parameters and get to that sort of interpreting of our confidence intervals.